Hey everybody, this is Kenny with the Yak with Kmac and coming to you live from my studio here on a Sunday morning where I used to every Sunday morning listen to a little show called American Top 40. July 4th, 1970. The calendar already said that it was 7 months into the new decade. However, what was happening in our country showed that the turbulent 60s really wasn't behind us that much at all. You see, all the things that really rocked our nation in the 60s, poverty, racial tensions, the hippie movement, a war in Vietnam that really severely divided the nation, well, those things were still going on. In fact, exactly 2 months beforehand, on May 4th, 1970, a peaceful demonstration against the Vietnam War on the campus of Kent State University in Ohio took a sudden turn for the worse, as Ohio State troopers opened fire on unarmed peaceful demonstrators. 9 of those demonstrators were shot. 4 of them lost their lives that day. And our nation asked the question, why? How could this possibly happen? All of a sudden, we were back. The demonstrations that had gone on throughout our country started happening again in the streets of our cities. And so even though it was July 4th, 1970, we were still back there. But on that July 4th day, one of the things that helped us heal, because you know music has a healing effect on everything. And one of the things that helped us heal, when we heard LA DJ and voiceover actor Casey Kasem come on and announce Marvin Gaye's End of Our Road as the number 40 song in the country, and this little show called American Top 40 would introduce the top 40 songs to every city in our nation, as well as 50 countries throughout the world, the healing process started. So for the next 8 minutes or so, I want to talk about the impact, the positive impact that American Top 40 had on my life and had on the culture of the United States. So in the summer of 1973, I'm a kid in the South Bronx, and I get into this terrible fight during a baseball game. It was silly. I know it. I look back now and it was crazy. And Reggie, who was, I'll call him that, the guy that I got into the fight with, who went upstairs and then brought down a knife, which then caused, and thank goodness I wasn't hurt, but it then caused my mother to kind of ban me from going out under only rare circumstances, either with my dad, my brothers, or with her. I definitely wasn't going out with her. I was kind of confined to my house most of that summer. And TV stunk back then. I got to tell you, TV's great now. We have a lot of choices. We had very few choices back then. It was either soap operas or game shows, and I wasn't really a fan of either. At nighttime, there was sports most of the time, mostly baseball. And so I started listening to the radio, and I instantly fell in love. Now, I have to tell you, a kid in the South Bronx, it was kind of our rite of passage to listen to R&B. And so the station I listened to probably the most was WBLS. But I started going down the dial. I started going to AM, and I started listening to WABC, which was a top 40 station, WNBC, a top 40 station. And I started hearing other songs, Live and Let Die by Paul McCartney and Wings that summer, Brother Louie by The Stories that summer. And I started to really like this. I loved my R&B, but I also liked some of the other rock songs and different types of genres that I started to hear. And then all of a sudden, one Sunday morning, I accidentally came across this show called American Top 40, and I heard Casey Kasem's voice. I instantly fell in love with it. And I was like, wait a minute, these are the top 40 songs in the whole country? You mean I could find out where my song ranks within the top 40 in the country? You mean that I possibly maybe have a shot to be a DJ and be like Casey Kasem one day? And man, the #1 song was a big deal back then. And I can listen to this show for 3 hours and hear all this great music. What an impact it had on me. And so when I think about the impact it had on our culture, again, remember where we're at. We're in the very early 70s. We're not that far removed from the 60s. And there were times in the 60s where concerts especially in the southern part of our country was still segregated. You had white kids on one side, you had black kids on the other side. And there are a lot of stories that I've read, and it's just hard for me to believe that if Little Richard or Chuck Berry or the Temptations were in concert and people were dancing, it's folks on one side, folks on the other, it's police in the middle. And there's a story about a concert that Chuck Berry was doing where there was pushing and pushing and pushing to the police. Finally, they said, let's let them go. The police thought there was going to be a riot and there was going to be a fight, and there wasn't. Those kids just wanted to dance with each other. I wish I had been there at that time. Man, that was probably just an awesome, awesome moment. But that's the healing power that music had. And that's how American Top 40 started to really have a direct impact on our culture. You see, American Top 40 came up with the top 40 songs through Billboard magazine. How did they come up with it back then? Because there wasn't internet. There wasn't, hey, songs being downloaded. So guess what? They used to have to call every single city, not every single city in the country, but every big city in the country. And they would call all the record stores. Yes, we had record stores back then. And they would just compile a list. Hey, what are the records that are selling the most? They would call radio stations throughout the country and ask, hey, what songs are you playing the most? And what songs are being requested the most? Yes, you actually could call a radio station and request for them to play a song. They would also call diners throughout the country and ask them, what songs are being played the most in your jukeboxes? Jukeboxes, really? Okay. And they would compile all that, and they would come up with their top 100, and then Casey Kasem and his team would play the top 40 songs on that. Now, here's why it was impactful, because if you lived in, let's say, Stillwater, Oklahoma, chances are you heard a lot of country music. Chances are most radio stations didn't really play anything by Marvin Gaye or anything that was R&B related. American Top 40 was your chance to get introduced to all different types of music. And how did that help the country heal? Well, you know what? If I'm in Stillwater, Oklahoma or Amarillo, Texas, and maybe I've never had any exposure to any other African Americans or African American or R&B music, this is by chance. And wow, I actually like this Stevie Wonder guy. You know, I actually like this Diana Ross lady, and it's pretty cool to put this on. I could still listen to Glenn Campbell. I could still listen to Kenny Rogers, but now all in one show, I've got all these groups of folks together. Here's another way that American Top 40 impacted our culture. American Top 40 was heard in 50 different countries on 1,000 radio stations in 50 different countries. So I always used to wonder, man, how do folks there in Korea know all the words to that Michael Jackson song? Well, this was the way how. This was one of the first exposures through the 70s and 80s that other countries had to our music here in the USA. Big, big impact on our culture. Because through music, they started to hear, hey, these are some of the things maybe going on in the USA. Here was one other reason. American Top 40 was heard on Armed Forces Radio. So troops that were stationed all across the world, and maybe in Vietnam or in Korea or in Germany, they were able to keep up with what the top songs were in the country. A big, big impact on our culture. So I'll spend this last minute talking a little bit about Casey Kasem. He had this show, started it in 1970, so the 50th anniversary is coming up. He had the show all the way through 1988. And contract disputes, things happen. He spun off and started his own show called Casey's Top 40. But American Top 40 continued. LA DJ and actor Shadow Stevens took over the helm in 1988. And Casey Kasem continued with a show called Casey's Top 40 on a different network. So they went against each other in most time slots throughout the country. And Shadow Stevens held his own for a couple of years, and then folks just continued to flock over to listen to Casey Kasem. And in 1995, Shadow Stevens ended his run on American Top 40. And for 3 years, there was no American Top 40 technically, but there was still Casey's show. And in 1998, Casey Kasem returned to American Top 40. And he did the show all the way through the end of the 2003 year, where he handed over the reins to Ryan Seacrest, where the show still continues, American Top 40 with Ryan Seacrest. I will end today with how Casey used to end his shows. Keep your feet on the ground and keep reaching for the stars. This is Kenny. We'll talk to you soon. Here you have a picture of the original host of American Top 40, Casey Kasem. Next up, you've got the person who hosted from 1988 to 1995, Shadoe Stevens. Next up, you've got Casey Kasem's permanent substitute host throughout the 70s and 80s. He hosted it over 50 times, and that was Charlie Van Dyke. Next up, you've got singer and songwriter Saida Garrett, who hosted it several times in the late 80s and 90s, but also hosted a television show, Casey's Top 10.